Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on this book, The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker.
Oh, yeah.
And this book is all about sort of recognizing signs of danger that people give off and things like that. And you sent over some excerpts.
Yeah.
And I'm really fascinated to kind of go through this with you because it seems like a book that a lot of people have heard of,
Yeah.
but maybe they haven't actually read.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of excited to dive in. And what I find so powerful about this book is that it's not just about avoiding violence.
Right.
It's really about understanding human behavior
Yeah.
and just, kind of trusting your instincts.
Absolutely. I think you hit
Yeah.
the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
De Becker's work is so insightful because it teaches us to really see the world with a more discerning eye,
Yeah.
to pick up on those subtle cues that we might otherwise miss,
Yeah.
and so often precede dangerous situations.
Yeah.
Hopefully, by the end of this deep dive,
Yeah.
you'll have a whole new framework
Oh.
for assessing risk and navigating these really tricky encounters with more confidence.
I love that a framework for assessing risk because that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
So, the book introduces this concept called the JCA model.
Right.
And this seems like something that's, pretty central to de Becker's approach.
Yeah.
Can you kind of break that down for us?
Absolutely. So JCA stands for justification, alternatives, consequences, and ability.
Okay.
And de Becker argues that these four elements, when analyzed together, can help us predict the likelihood of violence.
Yeah.
It's almost like a behavioral equation
Yeah.
where each element contributes to the overall risk factor.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's start breaking this down.
Okay.
And starting with justification.
Okay.
The book uses some pretty powerful examples to illustrate this point, like the Palestinian bombers versus the American bombers. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So de Becker points out that both sides, despite their vastly different ideologies and motivations, can perceive justification for their actions. The Palestinian bombers might see themselves as freedom fighters, while the American bombers believe they're protecting their nation.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that justification is subjective and often lies in the eye of the beholder.
That's a really good point. It really does make you realize that even if you don't agree with someone's justification,
Right.
understanding it is still crucial
Yeah.
to understanding their potential for violence.
Yeah.
So how does that tie into this idea of alternatives then,
Okay.
which is kind of the next piece of the JCA model?
So think of it this way. The fewer alternatives someone perceives, the more likely they are to resort to extreme measures.
Mm.
The book uses this really simple example of Mike and Tommy, these two guys who meet at a seminar.
Yeah.
To illustrate this, Mike has plenty of alternatives. When Tommy pitches a business idea he's not interested in, he can continue growing his own business, explore other partnerships, or just simply say no.
Right.
Tommy, on the other hand, seems fixated on this one opportunity and has really limited alternatives
Right.
in his mind.
And that limited sense of alternatives makes someone more persistent, right?
Absolutely.
Even when their advances are unwanted or,
Yeah.
whatever it is that they're trying to do.
It's like they have tunnel vision,
Yeah.
focused on achieving their goal no matter the cost.
And that's a huge red flag then, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When someone feels trapped with no other options in sight,
Yeah.
they're much more likely to lash out, to resort to violence or harmful actions to get what they want.
So let's say you find yourself in a situation like Mike's.
Okay.
How do you apply this understanding of alternatives to actually protect yourself? Do you think it's always about setting boundaries?
Setting boundaries is definitely part of it, but it's also about recognizing the warning signs early on.
Okay.
Is this person respecting your boundaries, or are they constantly pushing the limits?
Okay.
Are they trying to manipulate you into doing something you're not comfortable with?
Okay.
Really pay attention to these red flags, because that can help you avoid getting trapped in a dangerous situation in the first place.
That's a really good point. It's not just about reacting to a threat. It's about being proactive
Yeah.
and assessing the situation and seeing those cues that might indicate someone's on a dangerous path.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's move on then to the next element in the JCA model, which is consequences.
Okay.
This one feels extra chilling to me
Yeah.
because it delves into how someone's perception of consequences can shift
Yeah.
and potentially lead them towards violence.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And the book uses the example of Edward Taylor and Jim Hicklin, the radio personality,
Right.
to really highlight this point.
Yeah.
Taylor starts with these seemingly harmless actions,
Mm-hmm.
persistent letters, maybe a bit over the top in their admiration.
Okay.
But as Hicklin tries to distance himself, hiring private detectives to warn Taylor off, the perceived consequences for Taylor really start to change.
So wait, so the more Hicklin tried to protect himself, the more dangerous the situation became.
Sadly, yes.
That's terrifying.
Because in Taylor's mind, he's been wrong.
Right.
He feels like a victim. And that warped perception makes the consequences of escalating his actions seem less severe, even justified in his mind.
Wow.
And it's tragic because it ultimately led to a devastating outcome.
Yeah, it makes you think, how do we navigate those situations where
Right.
trying to protect ourselves might actually make things worse?
That's where understanding the potential consequences from the other person's perspective becomes really crucial.
Okay.
Are they likely to see your actions as a threat,
Right.
as a sign of disrespect, or even as an escalation?
Yeah.
It's about carefully considering the potential ramifications of your actions and finding ways to de-escalate the situation
Okay.
rather than inadvertently fueling the fire.
Gotcha. So we've covered justification, alternatives, consequences. Now let's talk about the final element of the JCA model,
Okay.
which is ability. And this one, I think, speaks to a fear that we all have on some level,
Yeah.
which is someone having the power to carry out a threat.
This is where things can get really scary.
Yeah.
The book uses the tragic ESL shooting and Ed Farley's actions to illustrate this point.
Right.
Initially, Farley was just a persistent, annoying coworker,
Right.
but once he acquired weapons, his perceived ability to inflict harm skyrocketed.
Right.
And that shift in his mindset ultimately led to this horrific act of violence.
What I find so disturbing about that example is that it seems like there were so many warning signs, so many red flags that were just missed or dismissed until it was too late. It makes you think, how can we as individuals recognize those signs and potentially even prevent tragedies like this?
It's about being aware of the signs, but it's also about being willing to act on them.
Yeah.
If you see a coworker exhibiting troubling behavior, making threats, or displaying a fascination with violence, don't just dismiss it as harmless eccentricity.
Right.
Report your concerns to someone in a position of authority, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Remember, it's always better to err on the side of caution.
It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play
Absolutely.
in creating safer communities and workplaces.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that silence can be complicit
Mm.
and that speaking up, even when it's difficult, can potentially save lives.
Absolutely.
So we've unpacked this JCA model, which I think already gives us so much to think about.
Yeah.
But the gift of fear goes beyond just assessing that potential for violence.
Right.
It also delves into like these nuances of communication,
Okay.
specifically the difference between threats and intimidations.
Yeah.
Why is that difference so important?
It's really essential for navigating these situations. A threat, as de Becker defines it, is a direct, unconditional statement of intention to harm.
Okay.
It's like someone saying, I am going to hurt you.
Right.
There's no room for interpretation.
Right.
It's a clear statement of intended harm.
Right.
But an intimidation is different.
So an intimidation is more about manipulation then?
Exactly. It's about using fear and uncertainty to get what you want to control someone's behavior.
Yeah.
And it often involves conditional statements like, if you don't do this, then something bad will happen.
Yeah. And the example he gives in the book is like, unless you apologize, I'll kill you.
Yeah.
And that example is so powerful because it highlights that difference, right?
Absolutely.
They're not actually saying they want to kill someone.
Right.
They just want an apology.
Yeah.
And the threat of violence is just a way to get there.
Yeah.
So it's a reminder that context is everything.
Absolutely.
You can't just take words at face value.
Yeah.
You have to consider the intent, the history,
Right.
all the circumstances around it, and not overreact to, mere words.
And sometimes even seemingly harmless words can mask a much more dangerous intent.
Right?
The book uses this term persistence.
Yeah.
And it's not the positive never give up kind that we typically think of.
Right.
De Becker really dives deep into this world of unwanted persistence,
Yeah.
where that admirable quality of never giving up takes this really sinister turn.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of being trapped. Of someone refusing to take no for an answer.
Right.
And their determination morphing into harassment or even worse.
And that story of Mike and Tommy that we were talking about earlier really illustrates this so well.
Yeah.
Because it starts with a chance encounter, but then it escalates from that initial enthusiasm to guilt trips,
Right.
harassment, eventually veiled threats. And it's just a prime example of how someone can manipulate and twist reality to fit their outcome.
It's like they're writing their own narrative, ignoring your boundaries, your discomfort.
Right.
and interpreting any response as a sign of encouragement.
Yeah.
De Becker calls this the engage and enrage dynamic.
Oh, wow.
The more you engage, the more you try to reason with them, the
Right.
more fuel you're giving to their obsession.
That's so helpful to understand. So how do you escape that engage and enrage trap?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like non-engagement is a key strategy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that some people just can't be reasoned with.
Okay.
That trying to placate or negotiate is only going to make things worse.
Right.
Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just simply disengage.
Wow.
Refuse to play their game.
That's a tough lesson to learn,
It is.
especially when you're naturally inclined to be polite
Mm-hmm.
and try to find a resolution.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes just walking away is the safest option.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a different context where violence can occur.
Okay.
And that's the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this section of The Gift of Fear was particularly sobering for me.
It is, and it often hits closer to home for a lot of people.
Yeah.
De Becker doesn't shy away from confronting the reality of workplace violence.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
highlighting some truly chilling examples from the U.S. Postal Service shooting to the U.S. Air Flight 1771 incident.
Yeah.
And what really struck me was the prevalence of denial.
Yeah.
Those missed warning signs, those red flags that were ignored or downplayed until it was too late.
Right. And it seems like those warning signs often come from a very particular type of person.
Yes.
This what is it, the scriptwriter?
The scriptwriter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so the scriptwriter is essentially someone who feels constantly wronged,
Okay.
who blames others for their problems, and who really sees the world as hostile and unfair.
Okay.
They often have a very rigid worldview,
Yeah.
resist any attempts to change their perspective,
Right.
and hold on to grievances very tightly.
And those grievances can tragically explode into violence, as we saw in the U.S. Air incident.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that ignoring those red flags can have catastrophic consequences.
Yes.
So what are some practical takeaways for our listener, even if they're not in a management position?
Mm-hmm.
How can they apply these insights to enhance their own safety in the workplace?
Well, you know, it starts with awareness. Learn to recognize those scriptwriter behaviors.
No.
The inflexibility, the blaming,
Right.
the tendency to see themselves as victims.
Right.
Trust your gut. If you encounter a coworker exhibiting these traits and something feels off,
Yeah.
don't ignore that feeling.
Okay.
Report your concerns to someone in a position of authority,
Right.
even if it feels uncomfortable.
Right.
It's not about being a snitch. It's about protecting yourself and your colleagues.
Right.
Workplace violence is often preventable,
Yeah.
but it requires vigilance and action from everyone.
That's a powerful message. I just want to pause for a moment and acknowledge that we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
You know, in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the J model, the differences between threats and intimidations, the unsettling world of unwanted persistence, and
Yeah.
the sobering reality of workplace violence.
Absolutely.
But there's one more critical area we need to address.
Okay.
And it's a topic that hits even closer to home for many people.
You're talking about domestic violence.
Yes.
It's a subject that many would rather avoid.
Yeah.
But as De Becker so powerfully illustrates, these tragedies are often predictable. And understanding the warning signs can be life-saving.
And that's exactly what we'll be diving into.
Huh?
In the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll be exploring that heartbreaking reality of domestic violence and spousal homicide,
Yeah.
and unpack De Becker's insights on how to recognize those warning signs
Okay.
and protect yourself and your loved ones.
Good.
So take a deep breath,
Yeah.
maybe grab a cup of tea,
Oh,
and we'll be right back to continue our exploration of the gift of fear.
looking forward to it.
Right, see you soon.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. You know, I have to admit, this next section of The Gift of Fear is one that really hit me hard.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about domestic violence and spousal homicide,
Mm-hmm.
a topic that, you know, is often shrouded in silence and misunderstanding.
Right.
And I think what's so powerful about De Becker's approach
Yeah.
is that he doesn't shy away from like these uncomfortable truths, you know,
Yeah.
like the patterns and warning signs that are so often overlooked.
You're absolutely right. It's a difficult topic to confront, but it's one we can't afford to ignore.
Yeah.
The statistics are just staggering.
Yeah.
And De Becker's work really sheds light on a disturbing reality. Spousal homicide is often predictable,
Mm-hmm.
and there are warning signs that we as individuals and as a society need to learn to recognize.
The book delves into this concept of the long, slow crime, where control and abuse sort of build gradually over time.
Right.
It's not always about like explosive anger or sudden acts of violence.
Right.
It can be this subtle erosion of someone's autonomy, their sense of self, their freedom.
That's a really crucial point. We often think of domestic violence as this series of isolated incidents.
Yeah.
But de Becker helps us see it as a process, a pattern of behavior that escalates over time.
Yeah.
The abuser might start with these seemingly small acts of control.
Right.
Isolating their partner from friends and family, monitoring their phone calls, criticizing their appearance.
Right. It's like they're slowly chipping away
Exactly.
at their confidence, their support system,
Their sense of reality.
Yeah.
And by the time physical violence enters the picture, the victim might feel completely trapped, isolated, and dependent on the abuser.
And that's why it's so important to recognize those early warning signs, right?
Absolutely.
Those red flags that might precede the physical violence.
Those red flags.
Yeah, and de Becker challenges some of these common misconceptions about domestic violence.
Yeah.
For example, he talks about why women stay in abusive relationships even when they recognize the danger. And this section, I think, really resonated with me because de Becker draws parallels to his own childhood experience.
Oh, wow.
Growing up with an abusive father.
Yeah.
And he talks about how, fear, financial dependence, lack of support can really trap someone in a dangerous situation.
And he also dispels this myth of the crime of passion.
Right.
Emphasizing that spousal murder is rarely an impulsive act.
Right.
Fueled by uncontrollable rage.
Yeah.
More often than not, it's a calculated decision.
Yeah.
The culmination of a long pattern of control and abuse.
That's a chilling thought. It removes that element of spontaneity.
Right.
That image of a sudden emotional outburst.
Yeah.
And it reveals this much more sinister reality.
The book cites examples where abusers meticulously plan their attacks,
Wow.
often stalking their victims after separation or divorce.
Right.
It's a reminder that leaving an abusive relationship can actually be the most dangerous time,
Right.
as the abuser feels their control slipping away.
Yeah, and that brings us to another sort of controversial topic
Okay.
that de Becker addresses, which is the effectiveness or lack thereof of temporary restraining orders,
Right.
TROs.
Yeah.
And he argues that, while TROs can offer a degree of legal protection,
Yeah.
they can also provide this false sense of security
Right.
and potentially even trigger further violence in some cases.
This was a section that I found both thought-provoking and unsettling. De Becker presents numerous examples of women who were murdered by their abusers despite having TROs in place.
Right.
And it really highlights those limitations of legal documents in truly protecting victims.
Yeah, it's a reminder that a piece of paper doesn't always offer real protection.
Right.
The abuser might see that TRO as a challenge
Exactly.
to their authority.
To their authority as an escalation of the conflict.
Right.
Rather than as a deterrent.
So for someone listening who might be in a dangerous relationship, what advice does de Becker offer? What are the key takeaways here?
The book really emphasizes, above all else, the importance of trusting your instincts.
Yeah.
If you feel unsafe, if your partner's behavior raises red flags,
Right.
don't ignore those feelings. Reach out for help.
Yeah.
Talk to trusted friends, family members, a therapist, or a domestic violence hotline.
That's such a crucial point. Because we often doubt our instincts, right? We try to minimize the danger. We make excuses for the abuser's behavior. And de Becker's reminding us that, our intuition is a powerful tool.
Absolutely.
It's a gift that we should never ignore.
He also encourages women to recognize the warning signs, not just for themselves, but for others who might be in danger.
Yeah.
It's about paying attention, speaking up, offering support to friends, family members, colleagues who might be experiencing abuse.
Silence allows abuse to flourish.
Absolutely.
And by becoming more aware, by talking openly about these issues, we can help break the cycle of violence.
And it's not just about recognizing the signs.
Yeah.
It's about knowing what to do when you see them.
Right.
Encourage the person to seek help, offer to accompany them to a shelter or a support group.
Yeah.
Let them know that they are not alone.
Yeah. The book also provides some advice for those trying to leave an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
It's about, planning carefully, creating that safety net.
Right.
And removing yourself from this situation as quickly as possible.
And remembering that leaving can be the most dangerous time. Abusers often escalate their violence when they feel that loss of control.
Right.
And that's why having a detailed safety plan is so crucial.
Yeah.
Securing finances,
Yeah.
finding a safe place to stay, and notifying trusted individuals of your plans.
So de Becker provides this list of pre-incident indicators
He does.
for spousal violence and murder.
Yeah.
It's sort of this checklist of red flags that can help assess the level of risk.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a long list.
Yeah.
But what are some of the most crucial indicators that stood out to you?
One of the most significant indicators, and this echoes what we talked about earlier, is the woman's intuition.
Right.
If she feels that she's at risk, that's a major red flag.
Right.
We should never dismiss those gut feelings.
Right.
Those intuitive whispers that something isn't right.
It's about trusting that inner voice, that primal sense of danger.
Absolutely.
That often precedes a violent act.
Another really important indicator is the man's behavior early in the relationship.
Okay.
Does he exhibit controlling or possessive tendencies? Does he accelerate the pace of the relationship?
Right.
Pushing for commitment or intimacy before the woman is ready?
Yeah, and de Becker emphasizes, watching for patterns of intimidation.
Absolutely.
Bullying, verbal abuse.
Yeah.
And he says these behaviors often precede the physical violence and should never be minimized or excused.
He also warns against the use of alcohol or drugs as an excuse for violent behavior.
Right.
If a man blames his actions on substance abuse, that's a huge red flag.
Yeah.
It suggests a lack of accountability and a willingness to shift blame.
Another critical indicator is a history of violence in previous relationships.
Absolutely.
De Becker stresses looking beyond the current relationship and considering the man's past behavior. Has he been abusive to other partners?
Yeah.
Has he exhibited violent tendencies in other areas of his life?
Right. And if the answer is yes,
yeah,
that's a very serious cause for concern.
Right.
The book makes it clear past behavior is often the best predictor of future behavior.
It's so important for women to understand that they're not alone.
Right.
There are resources available, people who understand, the complexities of domestic violence and can offer support and guidance.
We can't overstate the importance of shelters, hotlines, and support groups. These organizations provide a lifeline for victims, offering a safe haven, counseling, legal advocacy, and really a path toward healing and rebuilding their lives.
This has been a heavy topic, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore.
We can.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And by understanding those warning signs, by challenging those societal norms that perpetuate silence and blame victims, we can make a difference.
Absolutely. It's about empowering individuals to recognize those signs, to trust their instincts, and to seek help when they need it.
Yeah.
And it's about holding abusers accountable for their actions, rather than making excuses or minimizing their behavior.
Okay, so the gift of fear has equipped us with some powerful tools for understanding violence, recognizing those subtle cues, and navigating potentially dangerous situations. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the JCA model to the nuances of threats versus intimidations.
We have.
The unsettling world of unwanted persistence and the sobering reality of workplace and domestic violence.
Yes.
But de Becker doesn't just leave us with a sense of fear and caution.
Right.
He also offers a message of empowerment, a reminder that we have this innate ability to sense danger and protect ourselves. It's almost a paradox, isn't it? De Becker talks about how our modern world, with all its technology and emphasis on safety, has in some ways made us more fearful and less attuned to our natural instincts. We rely so heavily on these external systems to protect us, like security cameras, alarm systems, emergency hotlines, that we often forget to trust our own, internal alarm bells.
It's like we've outsourced our safety. And in doing so, we've lost touch with that primal sense of awareness.
Yeah.
That gut feeling that tells us when something is wrong.
Yeah. De Becker argues that by reclaiming our inherent predictive skills, by learning to tune into our intuition and recognize those subtle signals of danger, we can actually reduce fear and live more confidently.
Absolutely.
That's such a powerful concept. It's not about living in a constant state of paranoia.
No.
It's about reclaiming that inner knowing,
Right.
that ability to sense danger and respond accordingly.
Yeah.
It's like we've been given this incredible gift, this gift of fear, and we've forgotten how to use it.
And that's exactly what de Becker wants to help us rediscover.
Yeah.
That power of our intuition, the wisdom of our bodies.
Yeah.
The subtle cues that often precede those dangerous situations.
Right.
It's about learning to trust those signals, to honor those gut feelings, and to act on them.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. A reminder to trust my instincts and pay attention to those often overlooked warning signs.
Absolutely.
We've explored some pretty heavy topics, violence, manipulation, fear.
Yeah.
But we've also emerged with a sense of, I think, empowerment.
Yeah.
Like, we have a toolbox now
We do.
of strategies for navigating these situations.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners walk away with from this deep dive?
Well, I hope they walk away feeling more empowered,
Yeah.
more aware of their surroundings, and more in tune with their intuition.
Right.
We explored the JCA model, which helps us assess the likelihood of violence by analyzing justification, alternatives, consequences, and ability.
We also unpacked, the unsettling world of unwanted persistence, recognizing how seemingly harmless behavior can cross the line into harassment or violence. Yeah. And we confronted, those sobering realities of workplace and domestic violence, learning to recognize the warning signs and seek help when we need it.
Now, it's a lot to process.
It is.
But the core message here is this. You have an innate ability to sense danger.
Yeah.
To pick up on those subtle signals that something isn't right.
Right.
De Becker calls it the gift of fear.
Yeah.
And it's a gift that we should never ignore.
And we've discussed some practical strategies for managing those situations.
Okay.
From setting boundaries and disengaging to recognizing those warning signs and seeking help when we need it.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it comes down to trusting yourself.
Absolutely.
Listening to your gut and taking action to protect yourself and those you care about.
Now that you're more aware of these patterns, how can you apply this newfound knowledge to enhance your own safety and well-being?
That's a great question for everyone to consider. And we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Share your insights, your questions, your own experiences with the gift of fear.
Absolutely.
Let's continue this conversation and learn from each other. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and above all, trust your gut.